Well, happy quarantine, everybody. So, I have been asked for years now to do a video all about M-horn assembly and voicing. And so, I've never had an M-horn that I wanted to actually open up and show to you guys. My M3 is still factory seal wired, and so I don't want to open that up. And my first M5 I liked the tuning on it, so I don't want to mess with it. So finally I picked up this one, and I'm able to do an M-horn maintenance video for you guys. So yeah, I guess let's just get into it here. So I have this thing fully pulled apart. Manifold in the back there. Got the number 5 bell, number 4, number 3, number 2, and then the number 1 is opened up completely to show you guys everything here. And I'll go ahead and show you the nozzles on all of the bells, because that actually makes a bit of a difference. Excuse me. All right. So, anyways, first off, a little bit of M-horn terminology here. You got your bells. You got the manifold, of course. You have the heads. Now, on a Leslie, these would be called the chambers, but on an M-horn, these are the heads. And then you also have your back caps. When it comes to the bells and manifolds, this is what is called a scallop-based version, and you can see kind of why it got that name. Now, originally when these were first made, they were what collectors call round base. In other words, they were completely round all the way around the whole circumference of the horn. And the manifold was also had completely round ports on it instead of the scallop base. Well, when Nathan Airchime, the American licensee of the Airchime designs and manufacturer, when Nathan Airchime picked it up, of course, the Americans, being Americans, were like, hey, we know ways to save money, and so we're going to eliminate extra material on the tops of the bells to save on material costs. And so that's how we got the scallop base horns. Heads are all going to be round base variants. That's just because of the way heads are. That's just how they are. Back caps, there's been a few variations over the years. This is the most common style. It's got you can see the part number for the back cap over there on one side, and then they have these N numbers. Of course, the number 1 is for the number 1 bell. The N, I'm not entirely sure why it says N rather than M. If anyone knows the history on the letter N, I'd appreciate that, because that's one thing I don't know myself. The older caps are what referred to as the button caps. They have a raised circle in the middle of the spanner wrench boss. And the really, really old caps have the spanner wrench holes set on either side of the cap, but that required 5 different sizes of spanner wrenches, and so by switching it to the spanner boss in here, the number 1 all the way through the number 5 head, you use the same size spanner wrench, which is nice. Alright, so digging into the heads, once you take the cap off, you got your diaphragm assembly. Here's a completed one here for the number 2 bell. Here is a fully disassembled one for the number 1 bell. You have your nozzle, and you have your diffuser ring. Now, the diaphragms are very complicated multi-piece assemblies. Depending on which bell, there are either 2 or 3 large discs, and then there's a number of smaller washers and spacers, and then finally what's called the clapper disc, which is the part that actually, this is the part that actually sits on the nozzle and vibrates on the nozzle when the horn is in operation. Now, the 1, the 2, the 3, and the 4 bells all have 3 discs in their diaphragm assemblies. The number 5 bell only has 2 discs. And the 4 and the 5, they also have these smaller washers and spacers. These are non-metallic. I think they might be aluminum. I'm not sure what material they are. But basically all I'm trying to say here is that the diaphragm assemblies will vary a little bit depending on which bell you have. So the diaphragm assembly sequence, once you have all the parts and pieces and everything, for whichever bell it is, doesn't matter, you go with, you start with a 1-inch long, 1/4-inch fine thread bolt, and then you go your first washer, spacer, whatever you want to call it, and then you do your diaphragm discs, so 1, and then these 2 are homemade because this horn was originally missing. Actually, I want that one not there. I want this one on the inside. This horn was originally missing 2 of the #1 diaphragm discs, and so I had to make more discs myself. I have a whole separate video on that. So anyways, we got the big washer on the bottom there, 3 diaphragms. We have our spacer, another washer, whatever you want to call it, clapper disc, and then the last washer on top of that. And then, of course, a lock nut, nylon insert lock nut, goes on top of that to finish it off. And there doesn't seem to be any specific torque setting on these. Just tighten everything down as tight as it'll go without, bending or breaking stuff. Let's see. Moving on to inside the heads. If we just take a look at this real quick, you can see the rough surfaces are those that are the casting out of the mold. Everything else, though, is a machined surface in these heads. And there are many, many, many different angles and surfaces that were all cut in here. These M's are quite a work of art and very maintenance intensive too. So the older M's have the bronze press-in nozzles. The nozzles all have a different size O-ring on them. And the later M horns, in the late 60s, and then M's were produced all the way up through, the last big batch was in the early 80s for Western Pacific for M5s. The later M's had, instead of the bronze press-in nozzles, they had aluminum nozzles that were just cast into the head and machined to the correct nozzle shape. So, generally speaking, the nozzle goes in, and that just press fits down in there. And now, I'm just doing this for the video demonstration. When the video ends, I'm actually going to take this apart and lubricate everything, lubricate the nozzle and the O-ring with some silicone before I put it in there for good. So yeah, lubrication is important. So you get the nozzle that just presses into the head there, and then you have your diffuser ring that goes on top of that. Now, interesting thing about these diffuser rings, first of all, they're really tight fit. The bolt spacing on the bells is actually not even all the way around, because you can see I got 2 of the holes to line up, but 1 doesn't. So I just keep rotating until all 3 bolt holes line up, like so. Just another quirk of the M's. And then the diaphragm assembly, once that's all assembled and put together, it goes face down like that. And then the back cap screws in. However, this back cap, because they're threaded, you have to voice the horn, which is you have to put air through it and adjust the pressure on the back cap. So that's a whole other process in and of itself, and I think voicing is probably going to be a separate video here. So looking at the caps themselves, the inside, fairly simple, but still a lot of machined surfaces. One thing interesting about M horns is they actually have 2 clamp surfaces. They have the inner clamp ring and the outer clamp ring. And then you have clearance for the threads and then the threads itself. So when you have everything assembled, you have 3.5-inch long bolts that are installed inside the head, through the manifold, and thread into the bell. And then after the cap's installed, you have 2.5-inch long cap screws or set screws that go and actually secure the head, and these are just to squeeze the head together so that prevents the back cap from rotating back on you. All right, now some other peculiarities about the M's. The number 1, the number 2, the number 3 all use the same size gaskets. The number 4 and the number 5 use smaller gaskets, the same size. And just to show you, here's a 1 through 3 compared to here's a 4 and 5. They're just a little bit smaller. Now these gaskets are actually not that hard to find. Tom Aker sells them on eBay all the time. You can either get 2 sets of M3 gaskets to get enough for an M5, or just message him and say, hey Tom, I need some gaskets for an M5, and he'll send you an invoice so that way you don't end up with any extras. Okay, I'm going to pause the video real quick, and then I'm going to open up the rest of these caps so I can show you the difference in all the nozzles. Okay, I am back, and we got all the heads and everything else laid out here. Of course, the diaphragm assemblies, here's the number 1 after I tightened everything down, put it together. All these diaphragm assemblies could break down further the way the number 1 was, but I don't feel the need to do that just because that's a lot of extra parts. What's kind of cool is that some of these still have the shadow of the old factory stamping on there, which is kind of neat. Okay, first, as I mentioned, the caps. Now, one thing you'll note with the caps is that the spanner boss is the same size on all of those. That means you need the same size spanner wrench, which is good. I'm going to show you what tools you need for these caps when I do the voicing video. Just show you these caps. The number 5 doesn't have the 5 marking in it. It only has the part number. Everything else has the number as well as the part number. And it's interesting, and this may just be this particular horn. My guess is it's probably mixed parts, but some of them you can see it's just got the number cast into it in the side, and then others it has this number in like almost kind of like a simulated tag type thing. I don't know what the deal is with that. I am not as knowledgeable on M horns as I am on, say, the Leslies, for example. Looking over our heads, of course, we have the number 1, the 2, 3, the 4, and the 5. Now, one thing I previously forgot to mention that I'll go over now is a couple of things. There are 5/16 inlet M horns and 3/16 inlet M, excuse me, not inlet, inlet M horns. And what that means is it's in reference to the air inlet. Now, as specified from the factory, these were originally 3/16, and this is a 3/16 horn. Later, that inlet was enlarged to 5/16, which made the horns much, much louder, but also caused parts to wear out faster and change the balance of them a little bit. A lot of collectors prefer the 3/16 inlet size, and in fact, it's very common for M horns in collector service. They'll take a 5/16 horn, they'll drill and tap this to fit a little brass plug, and then they'll drill that brass plug to 3/16 to choke it back down to the, as one collector put it, as Swanson and God themselves intended. So just a fun little note there. Now, a couple of notes on the diffusers. As originally designed, the diffusers were bronze. And again, this was a Nathan Airchime thing. To save material costs in the early 50s, they tried using the early plastic of the era, which we now call Bakelite. Bakelite, as those of you who are familiar with it know, tends to crumble and crack and just not perform very well over time, and so the Bakelite diffusers tended to break apart and just fail in service, and that would cause the head to rattle loose on the manifold and just cause all sorts of problems. It's not uncommon in horns that had the Bakelite diffusers to see them replaced with home-built either steel or aluminum ones. This horn, thankfully, has a set of all 5 bronze, which is really nice. And yeah, that's about it. So let's see, the nozzles. Now the nozzles, like I said, they all vary. Now what's interesting and really important to pay attention to is that you can, for example, take a number 2 nozzle and fit it into a number 1 bell. But that's going to cause you all sorts of problems, and here's why. Some nozzles, like here's the number 1, are straight and flat. Some nozzles, for example, here's the number 2, are much wider and have a beveled edge on them. The internal diameter is also different between the 2 and the 1. So here's the number 1 nozzle on top of the number 2, and you can see the number 2 is a slightly smaller diameter. So each, and hopefully this kind of is a good illustration of, this is why the M horns, although they sound gorgeous, they were a maintenance nightmare, and they fell out of favor to other horns such as Leslie's and P's and K's that had interchangeable parts. 5 different bells, 5 different heads, 5 different diaphragms, 5 different diffusers, 5 different nozzles. Yeah, you can see where I'm going with this. There's a lot of parts to these things. Alright, anyways, moving on. Number 1 diffuser. Number 2. Number 3, this one's really thick and heavy. Oh yeah, all the diffusers are flat on the bottom too. Number 4, we go back to a flat straight sides again. And the number 5. So yeah, so that's about it for your basic M horn anatomy here. And M3, of course, you're only going to have 3 heads and 3 nozzles and all of that stuff, but everything stays the same regardless if it's a M3 or M5, just, you know, the number of parts and bells that you have is the only difference there. So, as I mentioned before, the process of putting these things together involves voicing them, which involves air, which I can't do right now because it's springtime in the Pacific Northwest, and if it's not raining, it's blowing wind at 50 miles an hour. So I'll get a voicing video up later, but anyways, here's the maintenance and assembly videos for you. All right, have a good one.